Bad news, guys. If you're woke, you're not only broke, you're probably also miserable. At least according to a recent New York Post headline, which claims that woke people are more likely to be unhappy, anxious, and depressed. The article cites a Finnish study, which concluded that folks who identify as left-wing were most likely to report lower mental well-being. The study evaluated the prevalence of critical social justice attitudes, which are ideas informed by fields like gender studies, queer theory, and intersectional feminism. Worth noting that the study did cite James Lindsay, so, take their findings with a grain of salt. But it's worth noting that for the first part of the study, the subjects were almost entirely university faculty and students. And many of those who reported anxiety and depression were from humanities and social science departments. And as someone who studied social science and philosophy as an undergrad and grad student, this honestly makes a lot of sense to me, because if you're spending your days reading and researching and teaching in fields that put a critical lens to society and explore ideas related to injustice, oppression, colonialism, racism, well, hey, you might need a couple stiff drinks to cope at the end of the day. Now, personally, I know that spending hundreds of hours reading about despair and anxiety in the text of the great existential philosophers and reading about alienation and capitalist ideology in the works of contemporary political philosophers often left me feeling pretty crappy. But these experiences also left me feeling oddly hopeful, as a lot of academics and writers in these traditions respond to the more grim analysis of society by theorizing about how another world is possible. But even I've wondered at times if this critically engaged attitude is really worth all the despair. I mean, would the woke students and myself be happier if we stopped worrying about critical theory and just got our butts into a CrossFit class? So today, we're gonna ask, is Donald Trump right that there's no happiness on the left? Or is there something inherently positive about feeling so negative? Now, before we get in too deep, let's be clear that we're not really asking if simply being smart makes you miserable, or if the best guy at your trivia league is emotionally weighed down by his massive knowledge of the sex lives of vice presidents. You know who you are, you freak. You know everything about all the vice presidents and who they had sex with. But if that gets you off, who are we to kink shame? In other words, we're not talking about this type of guy.
You're gonna go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole.
We're talking about folks who follow their curiosity and use critical thinking to see what the world is really like, warts and all. The authors of a 2023 article in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology lament the implications of their own findings that knowledge of daily political events contributes to worse psychological and physical well-being, which seems to imply that an awareness of what's actually happening in the world leaves you feeling pretty bad. Another negative side effect of overthinking can be stress. For example, according to Scientific American, a highly intelligent person may overanalyze a disapproving comment made by a boss, imagining negative outcomes that simply wouldn't occur to someone less intelligent. And this sort of overthinking can be isolating. While the Charlies of this world can knock back some cold ones with their buds at the end of the day, the deeply inquisitive are statistically more likely to be introverts, preferring solitude over happy hour with people who just don't understand their worldview. Okay, but before we keep going, I wanted to tell you about something that makes me happy. And that's when you sign up for our Patreon. There's a link in the description. We have a Patreon community. It's one of the best ways for you to directly support the channel. It makes us less dependent on advertisers and the fluctuations of algorithms. And we have a lot of cool stuff there. You get videos early with no ads, access to podcasts, extra video content, research deep dives. I'm starting a philosophy reading group there soon, so please check that out. We even have a $1 level for folks that just want to sort of throw something in the tip jar for us. And as we approach our 10-year anniversary, I think it would be really cool if we got to 1,000 patrons. We're close, but we're not quite there. So now's a great time if you've been thinking about it. There's a link in the description. Will it make you smarter? I don't know. Will it make me happier? Who knows? But think about doing it. Unsurprisingly then, there's a long history of philosophers and thinkers who were too smart for their own good and ended up socially alienated or just straight up dead because of their big, busy brains. Because if you clearly see a truth that's at odds with those around you, things can get weird.
See it so clearly. You use petroleum, you're a murderer. That's a fact.
Socrates' commitment to truth got him sentenced to death. Rather than countersue to avoid having to chug poison, he stopped at a gymnasium to talk to some youngsters about mathematics and knowledge instead.
How do you do, fellow kids?
And when his faithful followers tried to break him out of prison, he just wanted to hang out and talk philosophy with them. Galileo was condemned by the Inquisition after he questioned geocentrism. History and reality would prove him correct, but he had to deal with the consequences for being smarter than everyone else. Or more accurately, Galileo's crime was exhibiting the curiosity and open-mindedness necessary to ask if things we took for granted might be completely wrong. These examples might leave us wondering if having an inquisitive spirit is actually worth the potential suffering. It's like the marriage advice you might get from your professionally divorced uncle. You want to be right or you want to be happy. Now, Plato wrote about this in The Republic, which is a text that basically trolled Athens for killing the smartest guy in town. Using the example of the cave, Plato explains that a person becomes enlightened when they turn from the shadows on the wall and exit the cave to see the real world. But when they go outside, their eyes are overwhelmed by the sun. And then when they head back down into the cave, the prisoners mock their hazy vision. Once back in the cave, Plato explains, the enlightened one realizes they can't escape the messiness of humanity. And the other cave dwellers try to kill him. And there's a weird theme emerging here where someone says, hey guys, maybe things are actually different than the way that we thought they were. And everyone's response is, we're gonna kill you.
I bring you love. It's bringing love. Don't let it get away.
Break its legs.
But even if your fellow cave dwellers aren't sharpening their spears the second you walk in, returning to the realm of shadows can be a demoralizing experience. Once you know something is true, it's hard to feign ignorance as a way to get along socially. Like, for example, I know that it's stupid to eat bread at a restaurant. All it does is fill up space in your stomach so you have less room for the good food. There's no reason. Maybe if it's a dish that necessitates bread, but don't do it. Same thing with chips and salsa. It's a scam. And I know that, and no one else does. Often seeking wisdom and gaining social acceptance can be at odds. And some of us might have experienced this, and like you come back from college and you have to sit through holiday meals with backwards thinking relatives. One Thanksgiving, my grandpa got mad and yelled at me because I said unions were good. And he said they were not. And then he died, so I won. Because that's how arguments work. Whoever stays alive the longest won the argument. So, ha ha, Grandpa, I'm right, and you're dead. But isn't seeking wisdom what we're supposed to be doing as humans? Why do they make us spend 13 years in school if we're punished or simply miserable due to that pursuit of knowledge? This begs a lot of other questions about the purpose of contemporary education. That would have to be a whole other video. If you want to see that video, let us know in the comments if enough of you say, please. Then we'll make it for you. Aristotle opens his metaphysics writing, all men desire by nature to know because we are rational animals. This basically means that our primary function as humans is to use our capacity for reason to better understand the world and ourselves, to become more virtuous. But the idea that we're drawn to knowledge does not somehow imply that the journey to knowledge is going to be a fun one. As we've already talked about, there's tons of examples of philosophers being socially and politically ostracized, and in general just living some miserable ass lives. Which might make it surprising that there's a growing industry of folks who want to repackage the insights of these same philosophers as a new form of self-help. From videos that use existentialism to help us get better at dating, to books about how Aristotle can change your life, many entertaining folks are repackaging philosophical wisdom as practical self-help. Out of curiosity though, what philosopher do you think would actually be the best at self-help? What philosopher could make your life better in a practical way? Part of me wants to say it'd be like David Hume, but maybe there's others. Let me know what you think. Now, we see this in the proliferation of apps that promise to teach you philosophy in little bite-sized chunks, because you'll be crushing it on your next date when you're just dropping obscure facts about Wittgenstein, because after you say those facts, they're going to be like, oh my God, that was so interesting. I got to go to the bathroom. I'll be right back. I really want to hear more about this. And they're not coming back. You're never going to see him again. You're about to get ghosted on this damn date. It's maybe most pronounced though in this season's hottest self-help trend, stoicism, which is something we've already talked about in a previous video, but the gist is that a number of business-oriented influencers and Silicon Valley thought leaders have embraced stoic wisdom as a way to find happiness and success, even though we might say that the actual Stoics had more to say about eschewing pleasure and embracing suffering. From Stoicism podcasts to Instagram accounts to events like Stoicon, ideas from the likes of Marcus Aurelius and Seneca are increasingly exported and memeified, promising followers that Stoic discipline offers a steady path to a fulfilling life. Philosopher Alain Badiou argues that under the dominant logic of our society, which is one that places profit and economic power over wisdom, truth, or justice, categories associated with truth are converted into a more market-friendly simulacrum. For example, science becomes technology, love becomes sexuality, art becomes culture, and politics becomes management. Now, in a similar way, the emotional states that accompany truth also get turned into something else. So in this case, happiness becomes satisfaction. As Badiou argues, the category of happiness, such as it is promoted today, has largely been reduced to what I would call satisfaction. This is a picture of happiness that at root consists of asking ourselves how we can preserve a place we've been assigned, a place in the world such as it already is. So rather than happiness being associated with pursuing truths that challenge the world as it is, what we see in Socrates and Galileo, satisfaction is the feeling of being content with how things are and making sure that we have a role in this version of reality. In other words, it's about affirming things as they are and not questioning them. And if philosophers and other truth seekers like scientists and artists are concerned with this happy pursuit of wisdom, then we could associate the desire for satisfaction with today's thought leaders and Stoic influencers. Now, we expect the latter to drop mind-blowing aphorisms that explain everything and help us change our lives overnight, like miracle drugs made out of ideas. If only we could make drugs out of ideas. And many of these folks promise success if we just adopt the proper mentality or mindset, one which is of course often congruent with the dominant economic and social logic of society, again because their goal is to help you succeed in the world as it is. Badiou has spoken about his distrust of Stoicism as a contemporary philosophical brand, saying that the Stoic could say, be satisfied with being satisfied. That is a commonplace position that everyone, including me, more or less shares. But as a philosopher, I have to say that this is something different from what I call happiness. And philosophy has always sought to orient humanity toward this real happiness, including when this can only be obtained to the detriment of satisfaction. Now, to the self-help influencers, thinking deeply and embracing philosophical wisdom should serve the purpose of making you smarter, happier, or more successful. But this sort of philosophical critical thinking isn't a tool for feeling better or impressing folks at dinner parties. It's a method for pursuing truth and understanding for their own sake, one that should inspire us to seek truth and justice, not quarterly bonuses and vacation homes. But if you do have a vacation home that you don't always use and you want to share it with me or anyone on the Wisecrack team, please let us know. So if the pursuit of wisdom and a critical understanding of reality might leave you unpopular and unhappy, we still might be wondering, what's the point? I only live once. As we've discussed, the typical philosophical definition of happiness is different from the definition that you're going to get from the self-help influencers. Now, Aristotle used the term eudaimonia, which translates to human flourishing or living well. In his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle argues that this form of happiness, eudaimonia, is the highest good, and we can best understand how to achieve this state if we first consider the proper function of humans, which of course is to consume constantly, to consume goods, to consume content, to create data, which further facilitates the creation and consumption of content. He doesn't say that at all. For example, if we didn't have the capacity for reason and just had more animal-like functions, like the drive for biological maintenance, then things like truth and justice and speculative thought wouldn't matter. In fact, they would probably be detrimental to our survival, right? Because if you're a lion having anxiety about the meaning of existence, you're probably going to be a less effective hunter. And a gazelle fleeing the lion is more likely to end up as lunch if he's worried about the meaning of the categorical imperative. But our ability to contemplate makes it clear, at least to Aristotle, that we are made for more than mere survival. Humans are meant for a life of action belonging to the kind of soul that has reason. The more contemplation, the more happiness is there in a life, he writes, for contemplation is precious in itself. Contemplation for Aristotle is equivalent to philosophically engaged critical thought, sort of thinking that might lead you to rethink some fundamental assumptions about yourself and the world around you. Now, of course, these types of intellectual pursuits can be depressing and exhausting, and there's no guarantee that thinking this way is going to help you get what you want. But according to Plato, when we orient ourselves towards the light, truth and wisdom, it can actually have the effect of shifting our desires, which is basically to say, if society tells us to desire money and stuff and timeshares, and we don't get those things, we're going to be unhappy because we're going to be, incongruent with our desires. But if thinking about stuff shifts our desires towards better stuff, then we can be better aligned with those desires, and we won't care that we don't have Cybertrucks and timeshares. Now, in the allegory of the cave, Plato discusses the enlightened person's new attitude towards the cave dwellers. What about when he reminds himself of his first dwelling place, his fellow prisoners, and what passed for wisdom there? Don't you think that he'd count himself happy for the change and pity the others? Certainly. He imagines that the cave dwellers have awards for those who are best at identifying shadows, which represent crappy imitations of reality. But the enlightened person would never want one of these awards. In fact, he would rather suffer than live like that.
After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss.
Wisdom comes with consequences, sometimes severe, but it also sometimes comes with its own rewards. Even if knowledge isn't always pleasurable, it feels good to live in accordance with your function, at least according to Aristotle. Benji goes further in describing the type of happiness that comes through a life of contemplation. Happiness is what happens when you discover that you are capable of something that you did not know that you were capable of. For example, in a romantic encounter, you discover something that troubles your fundamental conservative selfishness. You accept that your existence is utterly dependent on another person. Before experiencing it, you hadn't had the slightest idea of that. And this other, who has become part of your existence, challenges the precautions that you usually take in order to protect yourself. Then you have to seek to draw the consequences of this happiness in order to continue living this primordial novelty. So you have to accept that this happiness can sometimes work against satisfaction. Put differently, experiencing true happiness can lead to discomfort, as it forces you to rethink the certainty you once held about your existence, and it opens you up to new and scary trajectories. Now, this is the opposite of satisfaction, which doesn't require any sort of radical change. Benji notes that unlike the individual orientation of satisfaction, happiness is fundamentally egalitarian, integrating the question of the other, whereas satisfaction, linked to the selfishness of survival, knows nothing of equality. And satisfaction is not dependent on the encounter or the decision. It occurs when we find a good place in this world, a good job, a beautiful car, nice holidays abroad. Satisfaction is the consumption of things that we fought to obtain. I mean, that right there, the connection of satisfaction with consumption, makes you think. Its relationship to acquiring nice things makes satisfaction, as the modern alternative to happiness, perfectly compatible with a social and economic system predicated on consumption, and one in which those with the means to endlessly consume are somehow assumed to be particularly intelligent. Or in the case of Stoicism, the idea that exercising restraint and resisting consumption to hoard massive wealth is the ultimate answer, which is why for Benji, the pursuit of happiness is worth it, as it's being willing to imagine something different, to run the risk of a disaster, precisely because even the potential of this type of happiness is worth more than an almost assured life of satisfaction. And he doesn't shy away from how this pursuit of happiness can lead to some fairly unhappy consequences, arguing that the world's masters do not like change. So if you choose to maintain against winds and tides that something else is possible, then they will use all means at hand in order to tell you that you are wrong. So is seeking out wisdom and committing to a life of curiosity and critical inquiry going to make you content, successful, and satisfied? Honestly, maybe not. Will it guarantee social and personal contentment and happiness? By no means. But in pursuing truth, we open ourselves up to the potential for a happiness that far transcends satisfaction and enjoyment. One which creates completely new paths for our lives and which can help us relate to the world in a fundamentally different way. Now, for some, this type of woke attitude might just make you miserable, and of course, this is why there's no happiness on the left. But for philosophers from Socrates to Benji, the momentary misery that can come through seeing the truth of reality, even the bad stuff, is worth the long-term potential of a happiness that comes through rejecting the world as it is in the hopes of pursuing something better. And to end on a personal note, while I've definitely been made depressed and anxious before in reading philosophy and thinking about the world and analyzing society, those dark moments are always balanced out from the adventure and the hope and the optimism that comes through being willing to imagine that the world could be totally different, which is way more creative and fun and exciting than simply shrugging our shoulders and saying, well, I guess this is all there is. But let me know what you guys think. Is the pursuit of knowledge worth the risk of misery, social isolation, and being called a huge bummer by your granddad? Or is ignorance really just bliss? Let us know what you think down there in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, for hanging out, for commenting, for liking, subscribing. All that stuff helps, and know that we really appreciate it. A huge thanks to all our patrons. Your support really helps keep the ship afloat. And if you're interested in supporting the channel and getting some extra content along the way, there's a link to our Patreon in the description. In the meantime, try to be happy no matter what, because heaven's probably not real. And even if it is, you might not be going there. I'll see you next time.